У нас следующий спикер Мартин Райзер. Мартин, прошу вас. Панель «За». Мартин является директором регионального офиса Всемирного Банка в Украине, Молдове, Беларуси.
I gave a title to what I want to say today, and the title is "Don't Keep Hoping for a Better Team." I want to convince you today that reforms are a necessary condition to overcome corruption. I'm not saying that reforms will definitely reduce corruptions under any circumstances. That would be naive. Reforms are necessary, but they are not sufficient. So essentially, I want to make 3 points. First, reforms are necessary to reduce corruption. Second, if reforms are not sufficient, what is missing? And third, what does this all tell us about designing effective reforms? First, when you rank countries worldwide according to levels of perceived corruption, such as measured by Transparency International, and then compare this measure with rankings of measures of the degree of deregulation, such as produced by Doing Business, or other measures of economic reform, such as those produced by the OECD or by the EBRD for this part of the world, you find a very clear correlation. This does not mean a weak state. Think of Singapore or Sweden. Governments in both countries are strong and rules are strict, but they work to support a functioning market, not to distort it. This finding is not new. Tacitus, a Roman emperor, is quoted to have said, "The more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws." He might have added, "The more cumbersome, internally contradictory, and frequently changing are the laws." And he might have been talking perhaps about a country we know well. How might reforms reduce the scope for corruption? For instance, by simplifying regulatory requirements. Natalia asked whether any of you felt the difference of the deregulation. Well, we actually do some research to find out. IFC has found out that between 2008 and 2010, the number of enterprises required to obtain at least one permit every year has declined from 52% to 38%. Is 38% enough? No, it isn't. It should go further down. But it's not enough to just ask for a show of hands, are things getting better? You actually need to monitor and get data. And in this case, the data show it's getting better. Or by reducing opportunities for corruption. The abolition of grain export quotas is a good example in Ukraine. Now they're gone, and I think we should all be happy with that. Or you can reduce distortions that remain and open the door for corruption. For instance, in the energy sector, which is a topic much talked about, the absence of good metering and transparency means that because of the different price that households pay and industry pays, if you can bill 1,000 cubic meters of gas to a household and then resell it to industry, you make $300 profit. Now, I'm sure that that isn't too difficult to do. Reforms also help by increasing transparency. In the banking sector, there is a provision now that forces banks to disclose their ultimate beneficiaries so that the public knows when they're putting their deposits whether this bank is lending to related parties, and they can draw their own conclusion. Now, this brings me to the second important point. The fight against corruption is ultimately a battle for improved accountability of those in power. It is often said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Political scientists tell us that politicians who don't feel any public scrutiny or pressure to deliver what they promised have actually little incentive to do what they said. Democracy allows citizens to change leaders that don't deliver, but that isn't enough. Ukraine has experienced frequent turnover of governments, but the challenges of corruption have remained the same, hence the title, "Don't Keep Waiting for Another Team." Without transparency and accountability, reforms may not work. That is why it is critical that the impact of reform is monitored. This is not just a task for the government, but also for citizens who need to gain the capacity to monitor effectively. I feel that in Ukraine, this important step is sometimes forgotten. People are satisfied with anecdotal evidence and quickly conclude, these guys are no good, let's elect a new team, only to face the same disappointment a year later on. Setting up proper monitoring systems, creating the conditions for real accountability is much more difficult. It requires active involvement of the citizens, not just passive resistance. So finally, how can reformers be successful? Clearly, it helps when you have strong leadership. For a government, and I'm now talking about the present one, that is in power for more than 18 months, declarations are no longer enough. It will have to be measured by its actions. In this respect, when you write an ambitious economic reform program, you better make sure that you implement it consistently, otherwise you lose credibility. Second, you need balance. If reforms are understood as measures that bring pain to the average citizen but leave vested interests unscathed and untouched, this is not the reform that I'm talking about, and I think it's not the reform that Boris was talking about. Third, you need to create the space for accountability. So you need to consult before you act, you need to adjust when things go wrong, and you need to monitor and solicit feedback. Reforming in this way is possible, and it will reduce corruption. Every government can do this. Ukraine's government should, and we will offer support when it does. Thank you very much.